The best of money matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. The secrecy of the ballot is a pillar of democratic integrity, a guarantee that every citizen can vote without fear or influence. As Singapore heads to the polls on May 3rd, some might be wondering, is my vote really secret? From serial numbers on ballot papers to sealed boxes under police escort and months-long storage in the Supreme Court, the process is designed to be secure. But does this also raise complex questions about transparency, accountability, and trust? How secret is your vote, really? Well, joining us today to share more is Dr. Rebecca Grace Tan, who is a lecturer in political science at the National University of Singapore. Hi, Dr. Tan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Tan, let's start with the ballot paper. I mean, it looks like each ballot paper has a serial number. Why is there a serial number on each ballot paper? How exactly is this number used during the voting process?
So basically, each ballot paper has its own unique serial number, and that's basically, so you have in every polling center, you have a set of ballot papers, right? And the idea is to make sure that you do not have doubling, is to make sure that each ballot paper is unique, right, as an identifier. So similar to, let's say, the easiest parallel we can think of, for example, you have a checkbook. I don't know how many people use checkbooks anymore, right? But they had a unique serial number. Both obviously for our checkbooks, it's obviously for our bank numbers, but also each check itself is unique. And that makes sure that basically you can't have a duplicate of the same check, right? So you don't draw out the same amount of money twice. So similarly, you have a separate serial number for each individual ballot paper to make sure that you cannot, for example, we shouldn't have two copies of a ballot paper with the same serial number, right? Just make sure that papers is not double counted. It also makes sure that there's no fraud in that sense. So that's the purpose of a serial number, to make each ballot individually unique to prevent fraud.
Okay, but can the serial number on a ballot be traced back to an individual voter? And if that's the case, under what circumstances?
So it can be under very, very specific circumstances. So I think it's easier to kind of understand how exactly the mechanics work, really, of the serial number. So everybody is given, there are two serial numbers that we're really talking about. The first is a voter serial number. So each individual voter, when they get their polling card, has their own unique serial number tied to the register of election, in which every single individual will have their own unique serial number, right? So every single citizen going out to vote. Basically, when they go to vote in their polling center, this is checked to make sure that they're in the correct polling center, and so their name, their NRIC, and their voter serial number is then checked. After that, the individual then goes to collect their ballot paper. And their ballot paper is basically in a book, right, of a whole bunch of other ballot papers, and each of those individual ballot papers, I then have a separate serial number for their ballot papers. When you get your ballot paper, after you've had that checking process, right, you're then told to go and collect your ballot paper. Then what happens is you provide your voter serial number to the election official, who then writes it down on the counterfoil. So the counterfoil is a little bit like a stub, like I mentioned, for example, like a checkbook, right? Where then your serial number is written down onto the counterfoil of the ballot paper, which also has the serial number of the ballot paper itself. But then what happens is the ballot paper is then torn out and given to you. So the counterfoil is left in the booklet, right? It's a kind of stub, think about it that way, and you get the ballot paper. And the ballot paper does not have the voter's serial number, but has the ballot serial number on the back. Then after that, so right now it's blank, and then you go and you cast your vote, you put it into a sealed ballot box, and then that's it. So the situation then is, at the period of counting, right? So later on, when the ballot boxes get taken to the counting center, get, unsealed and so forth under the watchful eyes of candidates and various counting officials, what will then happen is they only count, obviously, the ballot papers, right? The ballot papers are spread out face up. They're then counted, right? And, the votes then tallied. In that process, those who are counting have no access at all to the voter serial numbers. Because the voter serial numbers, the counterfoils are no longer with the ballot papers because they've been torn off, right? And so all that you have is purely the serial number of the ballot paper, and there's no identified way in which the counters of the ballot papers know who cast the precise vote. They know which electoral center came from, because obviously it's tied to a polling booth, and to a particular constituency, but they do not know the individual voters. And, so each polling box will often have thousands of votes, right? Hundreds and thousands of votes. So you cannot individually track that a particular piece of paper came from a particular voter. And that's the distinction here. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that whole process there, Dr. Tan. Now, Dr. Tan, ballot papers may be examined only under strict conditions, and safeguards are in place to make it difficult to find out how any particular individual, voted, as you've highlighted there earlier. Now, such an order will only be given if the court is satisfied that votes were, fraudulently cast or that counterfeit ballot papers were used in a way that affects the election results. What circumstances, though, constitute as, votes being fraudulently cast? Are there any examples?
So in Singapore, we have not had a case where there have been allegations of voter fraud. So Singapore has had a long track record of having transparent and fair elections in that sense. This is not just supported by the PAP and the ruling party, but also the opposition as well as independent observers. So I can give you a couple of hypotheticals, even though we can't draw, obviously, from Singapore since we don't have actual cases of voter fraud. So one case of voter fraud could be a situation where you could have, as we see in some countries, situations of ballot stuffing, meaning on the way to, let's say, a counting center, a candidate or candidate's party might put in more ballots to support their side, right? So it's fake ballots, they were not actually cast by voters, and this can obviously then artificially increase the support for a particular candidate or a particular party. So you could stuff ballots. That's what we call stuffing a ballot box. The alternative is obviously you could take out ballots, right? And that's one way of, obviously, if you can count the ballots, you can take out your opponent's ballots, then you could obviously win the votes that way. The alternative as well is you could create, this being the concern in places like the United States, where you have people who are not on the electoral, so voter fraud, where you have people either impersonating a voter who's actually on the registered list, so that things like identity theft, things like that, or, so you have impersonations and basically casting, votes that do not represent a voter's actual preferences, right? So in places like the US, we have discussion. In Singapore, we don't have these allegations because the chain of custody is very, very well protected. The ballot boxes are sealed first they're shown to be empty before the election even begins. So all candidates are there. They are shown the empty box, i.e. it's not been pre-filled with a set of ballots. Then they are sealed with anti-tampering tape and then put in, obviously, the polling booths. After polling closes, right, they are then sealed again. So the slot where people put in their ballot papers are then sealed again, and then it's then observed by all candidates in that particular constituency together with volunteers and so forth. This is then signed off and then passed on the chain of command. All the way down, the chain of custody is uninterrupted, all the way into the counting center. It then is sliced open, right, and all the ballot papers from that box are then poured out, as I mentioned, in the counting center, and then this is all done under the supervision of candidates as well as counting officials. And then this all happens. So it's under a watchful eye. They are then counted, tallied, sometimes recounted if it's very close, and then put back into the boxes and then taken, as you mentioned, to the Supreme Court for safekeeping until 6 months later when they are incinerated, also under the watchful eye of opposition members, government officials, and so forth. And so there's a chain of custody there that's basically uninterrupted. It is watched over. And so the possibility of things like ballot box stuffing or taking away ballot papers or voter fraud, because we do have voter serial numbers, has not happened in Singapore.
Right. Well, of course, Singapore hasn't have any of those, circumstances to happen where it was, fraudulently cast with votes here. But are there any safeguards that exist to prevent, the misuse of these serial numbers to identify how someone voted?
So the first thing, as I mentioned, is just the fact that the people who are counting the votes and anybody who has access to the ballot papers after they've been cast just do not have access to the voter serial numbers, right? So they have access, obviously, to the ballot serial numbers because the ballot serial numbers are on the ballot paper, but the ability to match it to an individual voter is not there because there's just no serial number, because they do not have access to the counterfoils, right, which are not in the ballot box. So that's the main thing, the separation there to prevent that kind of being able to match a particular ballot to a particular voter serial number. So that's one thing. It is technically possible. That's why you've got the safeguard there, because if there are allegations of fraud, then you want to be able to trace to make sure that, for example, there's no double count, there's not a duplication, for example, of ballots and so forth. So in the scenario where you do want to, let's say somebody challenges or raises the challenge of electoral fraud and they bring it all the way to the courts and the courts say, yes, they have a credible case, then there is a way of kind of back-checking to make sure that, for example, there are no duplicates of ballots. Then in fact, the voter serial numbers do match with people who are registered to that particular, constituency in that district, right? And so there has to be a way in which you can check it, because otherwise you couldn't check to make sure that in fact was voter fraud. But it's very difficult to do that because of the separation or the fact that you're keeping everything very closed unless there is sort of extenuating circumstances allowing you to open up the ballot boxes and actually match each individual ballot to a voter serial number.
Right, right. Well, let's also dive into what measures are in place in terms of ballot boxes, to ensure that votes are kept secret. Dr. Tan, you earlier mentioned that, these ballot boxes, the candidates themselves, the oppositions, they're also viewed that the ballot boxes are empty before the ballots are cast, just to make sure no one is not stuffed, right? But what happens to the ballot boxes after the polls close? Who transport them, and how is, the chain of custody ensured here?
So what happens is basically, so once they are closed, then what they do is so it's all sealed up. So they have to obviously seal, not just the boxes themselves are sealed, so they can't be reopened. The slots there also, are sealed also with, the same tape, that's anti-tampering tape. And then basically what happens is they're signed off, right? So everybody at the election center then signs off, then it gets passed on. So they're basically, when they're then brought into the counting, so then they go to the counting center, they're then transported to the counting center, and then after that, candidates and counting agents then observe the opening of the ballot box, and they then sign that, when the ballot box arrived, there was no evidence of tampering, it was sealed as it was when it had left the polling center, and then after that is unsealed. So cut open, all the ballots are then poured out and then counted again, then they're resealed again, or rather it's put back into the box and then sent over to the Supreme Court.
Well, then if ballot papers, say, are lost or destroyed before counting and the number of missing votes affects the result, fresh polls will be held. Has this happened before in Singapore's history?
No. So it has not happened in Singapore. I mean, I think it says a lot as to the process and obviously the efficiency of our public servants who are brought in to do the electoral process. So whether it is, those who kind of ensure the transportation, but also those who do the counting and those who ensure that oversee the general polling process as well.
It sounds like we have a very stringent process in place so that this would not happen. But Dr. Todd, during the vote counting process, how do officials then maintain transparency and prevent tampering? Are there independent observers or opposition representatives present during vote counting and transport?
Yeah, so what happens basically is that at the counting centers you have candidates, right, who are there. So the candidates from that constituency are there as well as counting agents, and you sometimes also have volunteers from the party as well, the parties that contested, and they will all be there watching the counting process. So it's a very long, arduous process, as you can imagine, where you have representatives from both or whichever parties contested, right? So if it's a two-candidate fight or two-team fight, then you have representatives from, let's say, the PAP and the Workers' Party or PAP and another party. If it's a multiple-corner fight, then you would have multiple candidates and multiple counting agents, representatives from parties as well as the counting agents. So basically, they'll all literally be there and watching the counting process to make sure that there's no issues in the counting process. So it's all done very openly. It's basically pouring out on the table and literally watching people count. Similar to if you've watched, say, in an exam venue that Singaporeans will be familiar with, right? You're watching your teachers count all the exam scripts before they can dismiss you. So everybody's watching it. The ballot papers are kept face up, so everybody can see what stamp is on the ballot. Right, so who is it counted for, and then it's put in vessels for counting. So it's all very transparent in the sense that everything's face up. So when the counting agents are sourcing it, you can actually see to make sure that it doesn't get miscounted. Yeah.
Okay. Now it seems like the ballots are also stored in the Supreme Court for 6 months thereafter, after the whole process, the votes are counted. Why so, and who can access them during this time?
So it's basically kept in the Supreme Court in the event that there's a contestation, right, of allegations of fraud. Who can access them in time? Technically, no one. I mean, obviously, somebody has to be able to, but generally they are kept under lock and key. So without a court order, they cannot be opened up.
All right. Overall, then, how does the ELD also balance the need for accountability with the need for voter privacy, you think?
I suppose in this case, the voter privacy is already accounted for the fact that it's very hard to track or to match voters' identities to voting outcomes, right? We obviously will know, for example, which polling center, for example, and therefore that's how we can know, for example, how blocks of voters, for example, in public housing, right, vote a certain way because they're all in a particular, polling center. But generally, we can't match it down to the individual level, right? So we can't go to that fine grain. So that's how I think they balance the privacy and, importantly, the confidentiality of the vote so that people can vote freely without fear of repercussions, right? So they can vote according to what they express their truest preference without kind of concerns about intimidation or anything like that, right? So that's the purpose of having that sense of confidentiality, or not just the sense, but the very real confidentiality that voters can have, and the confidence that they have that their vote is in fact secret.
Right. Well, as you've highlighted in our conversation, this rigid process just to ensure that the votes are kept secret. But what do you think are the common misconceptions Singaporeans have about the secrecy of their vote?
I think it comes down to the fact that serial numbers exist. So it is a debated issue within electoral politics about whether you should have serial numbers. So Singapore's put in serial numbers because the government and the electoral department has decided that it is more important to make sure that you do not have, for example, double counting. You can match the identities of individuals to ensure that you don't have a situation where there's voter fraud, right? And this works because we have nationally provided identification cards and things like that. But in some countries, serial numbers for voter identification should be removed because of concerns that or fears that you could potentially trace back an individual to a ballot paper. In Singapore, we have no evidence this is happening. This has happened. Nobody's raised this as as a very real concern, because we obviously every election we have millions of people who vote for, or not millions, but we have a sizable number of people who vote for the opposition and face no repercussions for that. And so there's no evidence that this is a concern. But there is a debate, and so some countries have done away with it, having voter serial numbers. But I think the presence of serial numbers creates a sense that there's a unique identifying code with each voter. So potentially, because the voter's serial number is written down on the counterfoil that I mentioned earlier, there's the potential it can be traced back to, and then you could go to the register, the electoral register, and find out, who serial number. That is potentially what could happen. But we have no evidence that it has happened, and there's been that abuse.
Well, overall, do you think enough is being done to reassure the public that their vote cannot be traced back to them, Dr. Tan?
I think they've been trying. I think there've been lots of efforts to do this. A lot of public messages are out to assure voters about the secrecy of their vote. And so the government's done this through various government agencies. The media has been doing this as well. So the Straits Times, for example, has done this. We've also actually seen opposition parties do this as well. So the Workers' Party has published, basically every election, different opposition parties will publish videos or write pieces that basically talk about the process. And also the other thing as well is there have been independent observers who've come in and done that observation, have graded Singapore and said basically the electoral process in Singapore, at least the act of casting a vote and so forth, and the counting of votes is done in secrecy, and and voters' identities are kept confidential. I'm not sure more people can have to assuage some of their concerns, except for the fact that we do have a track record, I think, of lots of people voting opposition. If that's the concern is that you face retribution for voting opposition. We have lots of people who voted opposition and without any ramifications for their individual vote. Also, to be honest, it's also very difficult to if you wanted to track somebody down, the sheer logistical nightmare would be to kind of sift through thousands of ballot papers in order to match an individual. It would take a lot of logistics, take a lot of time and effort, and I'm not sure that the government is that interested in the individual voters. Now, they care about the aggregate voters in terms of the outcomes, but the government has shown no interest in tracking down individual voters.
Definitely.
So, I mean, I don't know if that assuages anybody's concerns, but I do think that there's no evidence to suggest, and I think there have been efforts by many sides of the different political spectrums in Singapore to assuage voters of those fears.
Right. Well, that has been a great, insightful discussion with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tan, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was Dr. Rebecca Grace Tan, who is a lecturer in political science at the National University of Singapore. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.